My boss fired me after I rejected his dinner invitation 3 times. He didn't expect a lawsuit. My name is Gia Miller. I'm 29 years old. And until 3 months ago, I was a senior data analyst at Meridian Financial Services in downtown Seattle. I'd built my career on numbers, patterns, and cold hard facts skills that would prove more valuable than I ever imagined when my boss decided I was his next conquest. What Simon Crawford didn't know was that I'd been documenting everything from day one. And when he finally pushed too far, I was ready to show him exactly what happens when you mess with someone who knows how to build an airtight case. The text that ended my career came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Your services are no longer needed. Clear out your desk by noon. Security will escort you out. No explanation, no meeting, just digital dismissal after 3 years of exemplary performance reviews. But I wasn't surprised. I'd been expecting this ever since I'd refused Simon's latest dinner invitation the week before. What Simon didn't expect was that I'd been preparing for this moment for months, and his casual cruelty was about to become the centerpiece of the most expensive mistake of his life. I'd always been the type of person who crossed her T's and dotted her I's. My apartment was organized by color and function. My work files were immaculately labeled, and I kept backup copies of everything important. My friends used to joke that I was anal retentive enough to alphabetize my spice rack, which I had. Thank you very much. But what they didn't understand was that attention to detail wasn't just a personality quirk. It was a survival skill I'd learned growing up as the daughter of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. When you don't have safety nets, you learn to create your own. That meticulous nature had served me well at Meridian Financial Services, where I'd started as a junior analyst straight out of graduate school and worked my way up to senior analyst in just 3 years. My specialty was risk assessment, identifying patterns in data that others missed, predicting potential problems before they became expensive disasters. I was good at my job, really good, which made what happened next all the more infuriating. 6 months earlier, Simon Crawford had been promoted to Director of Analytics, making him my direct supervisor. The announcement had been made during our monthly all-hands meeting, where CEO Margaret Hastings praised Simon's innovative approach to client relations and his natural leadership abilities. I'd clapped politely along with everyone else, though something about Simon's victory speech had set my teeth on edge. I believe in building relationships, he'd said, flashing that $1,000,000 smile at the room full of employees. Not just with clients, but with our team members. Success isn't just about the numbers on a spreadsheet, it's about connecting with people, understanding what motivates them, bringing out their best potential. At the time, I'd thought it was typical corporate speak. Looking back, I should have recognized it as his manifesto. Simon was objectively attractive, tall, well-dressed, with salt and pepper hair that suggested distinguished experience rather than advancing age. He drove a BMW, wore expensive suits, and had the kind of confident swagger that attracted admirers throughout the office. I'd heard whispers about his divorce settlement from his previous marriage, speculation about his dating life, and plenty of comments from female colleagues about his undeniable charm. Personally, I found him about as charming as a tax audit. Maybe it was my natural skepticism, or maybe it was the way I'd caught him staring at Jessica from accounting during that first meeting, not looking at her face. Mind you, either way, my intuition was flashing warning signs before he'd even settled into his new corner office. At first, everything seemed normal. He was charming, professional, even complimentary about my work. Gia's our star analyst, he'd say in team meetings, flashing that smile that probably worked on half the women in the office. The Morrison risk assessment she completed saved our client nearly $2 million in potential losses. That's the kind of proactive thinking that drives results. I should have seen the red flags, but I was focused on landing the senior analyst promotion I'd been working toward for 2 years. The position came with a $15,000 salary bump, my own office instead of a cubicle, and the kind of project leadership responsibilities I'd been craving. More importantly, it would put me one step closer to my ultimate goal, becoming the youngest director in Meridian's history. Simon seemed supportive of my ambitions, at least initially. "You've got real potential, Gia," he told me during my first week under his supervision. "The question is whether you're willing to do what it takes to reach the next level." "I'm willing to work hard," I'd replied, thinking about the 60-hour weeks I'd been pulling for the past year. "Hard work is just the baseline," Simon said, perching on the edge of my desk in a way that forced me to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. "Success in this business is about relationships, trust, the kind of connection you can't build during regular business hours." I'd nodded politely, but something in his tone made my skin crawl. The conversation felt like a test, though I wasn't sure what the right answer was supposed to be. The dinner invitations started 2 weeks later. "The team should celebrate closing the Morrison account," Simon suggested after a particularly successful project presentation. "How about dinner at the Metropolitan, my treat?" The Metropolitan was Seattle's most expensive steakhouse, the kind of place where a single meal could cost more than my monthly grocery budget. I'd never been, though I'd heard plenty about it from colleagues who'd celebrated major deals there. "That's very generous," I said carefully, "but I have plans tonight." It wasn't technically a lie. I had plans to go home, order Thai food, and binge-watch Netflix while reviewing the Henderson portfolio. But something about Simon's invitation felt like a trap I didn't want to walk into. "Of course," Simon said, his smile never wavering. "How about tomorrow night?" "I appreciate the offer, but I have a policy about keeping work and personal life separate." That's when I saw it, just a flicker, lasting maybe half a second, of something cold and calculating behind his practiced charm. His smile faltered, then returned even brighter than before. "Very professional of you," he said, but I caught the way his eyes hardened. "Though, some of the best career opportunities happen outside the office. Networking, relationship building, it's all part of moving up in this business." I'd heard that line before from other men in positions of power, and I knew exactly what kind of relationship building he had in mind. "I prefer to let my work speak for itself," I replied evenly, then returned to my computer screen, effectively ending the conversation. That's when things started to change. The shift was subtle, at first small exclusions that could be explained away as oversight. Suddenly, I wasn't being invited to certain client calls. "Oh, didn't I CC you on that email?" Simon would say with feigned concern. "My mistake. You didn't miss much anyway, just routine check-ins." But I knew these weren't routine check-ins. The Blackstone Group was expanding their portfolio, and I'd been the primary analyst on their account for 8 months. Missing their strategy meetings was like being benched during the championship game. Projects I'd been leading for months were quietly reassigned. "We're restructuring the team dynamics," Simon explained when I questioned him about the Henderson analysis being handed to Marcus, a junior analyst with half my experience and a tendency to confuse correlation with causation. "Fresh perspectives, you understand. Sometimes being too close to a project can limit creative thinking." But I understood perfectly. This was retaliation, and it was escalating. My cubicle neighbor, Jenny Martinez from the marketing team, was the first to notice. "Everything okay?" she asked one afternoon, glancing over the partition that separated our workspaces. "You seem stressed lately." Jenny was one of those naturally observant people who noticed everything: who was dating whom, which departments were having budget meetings, whose projects were getting fast-tracked. She'd been at Meridian for 5 years and had developed an impressive network of office intelligence. "Just work stuff," I said, not wanting to get into details. "Simon stuff," she asked quietly, then quickly looked around to make sure no one was listening. "Because I've heard things." "What kind of things?" Jenny leaned closer, lowering her voice even further. "Jessica from accounting transferred to the Portland office last month. Officially, it was for personal reasons, but she told her friend in HR that she couldn't work with Simon anymore. Something about him making her uncomfortable." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Uncomfortable how?" That's all I know, Jenny said. But Jessica seemed really shaken up before she left. And there was something with his previous assistant too, Maria Santos. She requested a transfer to a different department after only working for him for 2 months. That night, I went home and started doing research. Maria Santos was now working as an administrative coordinator in the legal department, a lateral move that probably came with a pay cut. Jessica Martinez had deleted her LinkedIn profile entirely, which seemed unusual for someone in their mid-20s trying to build a career. More concerning was what I found when I searched for Simon's previous employment. He'd worked at Convergent Financial before joining Meridian, but his LinkedIn profile was vague about why he'd left. The gap between his end date at Convergent and his start date at Meridian was longer than usual, almost 4 months, which seemed odd for someone with his apparent qualifications. I made a mental note to dig deeper. But first, I had more immediate concerns. The dinner invitations were becoming more frequent and more pointed. "There's a client dinner next week with the Blackstone Group," Simon announced during our weekly team meeting. "Gia, you've been working on their portfolio analysis. You should join us." I felt every eye in the conference room turn toward me. Marcus, who'd taken over the Henderson project, looked confused. Sarah from compliance raised an eyebrow. Even Jim, our department's most senior analyst, seemed surprised. "I'd be happy to prepare a presentation for you to deliver," I offered. Simon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's not quite the same thing, is it? Client relationships require face-to-face interaction, personal connection, but if you're not comfortable with that aspect of the job..." The implication hung in the air like smoke, around the conference table. My colleagues shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but unsure of its source. Marcus looked like he was trying to solve a complex equation. Sarah was studiously avoiding eye contact with everyone. "I'm certainly comfortable with client interactions," I said carefully. "I've been handling the Blackstone account successfully for 8 months. I just think it's important to maintain appropriate professional boundaries." "Appropriate professional boundaries," Simon repeated, as if tasting the words. Interesting perspective, though I have to wonder if that kind of rigid thinking might limit your growth potential here. After the meeting, Simon cornered me by the elevator bank. The hallway was empty except for us, which somehow made his presence feel more intimidating despite the open floor plan visible through the glass walls. "You know, Gia, I'm starting to worry about your commitment to advancement," he said, standing just a little too close. "These opportunities I'm offering, they don't come around often. In fact, they don't come around at all for people who aren't willing to invest in relationship building." I met his gaze directly, though my heart was pounding. "Simon, I appreciate your interest in my career development, but I maintain professional boundaries with supervisors. I'm sure you understand." His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, I understand perfectly. The question is, do you understand what you're turning down?" There was something predatory in his tone that made my skin crawl. This wasn't about networking or professional development. This was about power and control. And suddenly, I realized that Jenny's casual gossip about Jessica and Maria wasn't just office drama. It was a pattern. That night, I stopped at Target on my way home and bought 3 things: a small digital recorder, a composition notebook, and a pack of pens, if Simon Crawford wanted to play games. I was going to make sure I documented every move. If there's one thing data analysts excel at, it's systematic record-keeping. I created a secure folder on my personal cloud drive titled Professional Development, innocuous enough to avoid suspicion if anyone glimpsed my screen. Every interaction with Simon got logged: date, time, location, witnesses present, exact quotes when possible. I also researched Washington state's recording laws and learned it was a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record conversations without Simon's knowledge as long as I was a participant. The recordings lived in a password-protected folder disguised as podcast downloads. My system was methodical digital record screenshots of every email exchange, saved to multiple cloud platforms, calendar invitations that were suddenly rescinded, project assignments that disappeared from our team management system, physical evidence, printed copies of performance reviews, client feedback, and project completion reports stored in a safety deposit box at my bank. Audio documentation, voice memos, recorded during every conversation with Simon, time-stamped and backed up immediately. Witness information, names, and contact details of colleagues who observed his behavior, along with notes about what they'd seen or heard. The pattern became clear quickly. Simon's behavior followed a predictable cycle: inappropriate invitation, my decline, escalating pressure, then professional retaliation when I didn't cave. He was systematic about it, which made him easier to predict and document. "You know what your problem is, Gia," he said during one particularly tense conversation, leaning against my cubicle wall in a way that forced me to crane my neck to look at him. Several colleagues were within earshot, but they'd learned to avoid getting involved in Simon's coaching sessions. I kept typing while he talked, the sound of my keyboard providing a steady rhythm to his increasingly agitated monologue. In my earpiece, barely visible beneath my hair, the recording app was capturing every word. "You think being good at your job is enough," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "But this is a relationship business. People want to work with people they like, people they've connected with outside these sterile office walls." "I'm very good at building professional relationships," I said without looking up from my screen. "My client satisfaction scores are consistently above department average." "Professional relationships," he scoffed. "That's exactly what I mean. Everything with you is so formal, so cold. Clients want to feel like they're working with friends, not robots." I finally stopped typing and turned to face him fully. "Simon, I appreciate your feedback about my interpersonal skills. If you have specific concerns about my client interactions, I'd be happy to discuss them during our scheduled one-on-one meetings." "Our scheduled meetings," he repeated mockingly. "You know what, forget the scheduled meetings. I'm offering you a chance to build a real connection here. Dinner. Just the two of us. We could discuss your career trajectory, maybe talk about that promotion you've been angling for." Several heads turned in our direction. Marcus pretended to be absorbed in his monitor, but I could see him listening. Sarah from compliance had stopped typing altogether. "As I've mentioned before, I prefer to keep professional relationships professional," I said clearly, making sure my voice carried to the nearby cubicles. "If you'd like to discuss my performance or advancement opportunities, I'd be happy to schedule a meeting during business hours." Simon's laugh was cold and sharp. "During business hours? In the office? With witnesses around?" He shook his head like I was a child who couldn't understand basic concepts. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about propriety, Gia. This is about whether you're a team player or not." That conversation was recorded in its entirety, along with the follow-up discussion I had with Marcus 20 minutes later. "Was that as weird as it sounded?" Marcus asked, appearing at my cubicle with a concerned expression. "What do you mean?" "The whole dinner thing. It seemed like he was pressuring you about something personal." I chose my words carefully. "Simon has some strong opinions about networking and relationship building." Marcus frowned. "Yeah, but the way he said it, I mean, my girlfriend works in HR, and she says that kind of pressure could be considered—" He stopped himself, glancing around nervously. "Could be considered what?" "Nothing. Forget I said anything. I just... Be careful." "Okay. There's something about that guy that doesn't sit right with me." I made note of Marcus's concerns in my documentation. If this escalated to a formal complaint, having witnesses who'd observed Simon's behavior would be crucial. 2 weeks later, I learned just how right Marcus's instincts were. The quarterly review meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon in Simon's office. I'd been expecting retaliation, but I wasn't prepared for the creative fiction he'd crafted about my performance. His office was a shrine to his own success diplomas, awards, photos of him with various clients and executives. The massive desk created a physical barrier between us, and he'd positioned his chair slightly higher than mine, a classic power play that probably worked on less observant employees. "I'm concerned about your communication skills," he began, reading from a document I'd never seen before. "Several team members have reported that you seem distant, unengaged in collaborative efforts." "Which team members?" I asked, pulling out my own folder of documentation. "That's not really the point," Simon said dismissively. "The point is perception, and the perception is that you're not fully committed to being part of this team." I opened my folder and pulled out printed copies of every positive email, client compliment, and project success from the past quarter. According to my records, I've exceeded every performance metric we discussed during my last review. The Morrison account analysis generated an additional $2.3 million in revenue for the client. The risk assessment model I developed has been adopted by 3 other departments. Client satisfaction scores for my accounts average 94%. Simon barely glanced at my documentation. "Numbers don't tell the whole story. Gia, leadership requires interpersonal skills, the ability to build relationships, to go above and beyond the basic job requirements." "Are you referring to the dinner invitations I've declined?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Simon's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something uglier underneath a flash of anger, quickly suppressed. "I'm referring to your unwillingness to engage with this team on a personal level," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Your resistance to opportunities for professional development. Your general attitude of superiority that's been noticed by multiple colleagues." Superiority. I kept my voice level, though my heart was racing. "Can you provide specific examples of this attitude? I don't need to justify my assessment to you." Simon's professional veneer was cracking now, his true nature starting to show. "What I need is for you to understand that your current trajectory is unsustainable. Unless there are significant changes in your approach to teamwork and professional development, I'll have to recommend that we reconsider your position here." There it was, the threat I'd been expecting. I'd been recording the entire conversation, and now I had him on tape directly linking my job security to my refusal of his personal invitations. "I see," I said calmly, making a note in my folder. "And what specific changes would you recommend?" Simon leaned back in his chair, his smile returning like a predator who'd cornered his prey. "Well, there's that client dinner next Friday. Blackstone Group is expanding their portfolio, and they specifically requested insight on emerging market trends, your specialty. It would be a shame if you missed that opportunity." "Will other team members be attending this dinner?" "Just the 2 of us. Sometimes the most productive conversations happen in intimate settings, away from the distractions of the office environment." I nodded slowly, as if considering it. "I'll need to check my calendar and get back to you." Simon's smile widened, and for a moment he looked almost triumphant. "Of course, but don't take too long deciding. Gia, opportunities like this don't wait forever, and neither does your career advancement." That afternoon, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Mrs. Catherine Thompson, an employment attorney whose name I'd found through the Seattle Bar Association's referral service. The second was to Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist who specialized in workplace trauma, because I was smart enough to know I'd need documentation of the emotional impact of Simon's behavior. The third was to my bank, to discuss increasing my emergency fund in case I needed to survive without income for a while. I was done being Simon Crawford's victim. It was time to become his worst nightmare. Mrs. Thompson's office was in a sleek downtown building that screamed expensive legal expertise. The waiting room featured leather furniture, original artwork, and law journals arranged with museum-like precision. Everything about the space communicated competence and success, exactly what I needed. Mrs. Thompson herself was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She wore a perfectly tailored navy suit and the kind of jewelry that suggested she won more cases than she lost. after listening to my recorded conversations and reviewing my documentation. She leaned back in her leather chair and smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. Ms. Miller, in 23 years of practicing employment law, I've rarely seen such thorough documentation from a client. You've essentially built the case for us. Is it enough? I asked. It's more than enough for sexual harassment and retaliation claims, but I suspect there's more here. She tapped her pen against my file. Men like your Mr. Crawford rarely limit their behavior to one victim. Have you noticed any patterns with other female employees? I thought about Jenny's gossip and my own research. There was Jessica from accounting who transferred to Portland suddenly, and Maria from HR mentioned some personality conflicts between Simon and his previous assistant, though she transferred to another department. Plus, there's something odd about Simon's employment history. He left his previous job at Convergent Financial under unclear circumstances. Mrs. Thompson made detailed notes. We'll want to look into that. In cases like this, establishing a pattern of behavior is crucial. One complaint can be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Multiple complaints show systematic misconduct. She pulled out a legal pad and began sketching what looked like a timeline. Now, let's talk about your immediate situation. You mentioned he's pressuring you about a dinner meeting. This Friday, he's made it clear that my job depends on it. Here's what we're going to do. Mrs. Thompson opened her laptop and began typing. First, you're going to send him an email declining the dinner and reiterating your preference for professional meetings during business hours. Be polite but firm, and copy his supervisor. Make sure the language is crystal clear about what you're declining and why. Won't that just make him angrier? Oh, absolutely. But here's the thing about predators like Simon, they're predictable. When their usual tactics don't work, they escalate. And when they escalate while we're watching and documenting, they make mistakes that become evidence. Mrs. Thompson pulled up what looked like a template email. We're going to give him enough rope to hang himself. Then, we wait. Wait for what? For him to do exactly what we expect him to do, retaliate. When he does, we'll be ready with a federal complaint that will make his life very complicated. She was right. 2 days after I sent the email politely declining the dinner invitation and suggesting we meet during business hours instead, I found myself being escorted out of the building by security while my former colleagues watched in stunned silence. The beauty of working with an experienced attorney became clear within hours of my termination. Mrs. Thompson had anticipated Simon's move and already had preliminary paperwork prepared for filing with both the EEOC and the Washington State Human Rights Commission. Firing you within 48 hours of your written refusal to attend a personal dinner meeting, Mrs. Thompson said when I called her from the parking lot, still holding my cardboard box of personal belongings. That's what we call smoking gun evidence of retaliation. She filed complaints that same day, then immediately requested all personnel files related to female employees who had reported to Simon over the past 3 years. She also sent a preservation notice to Meridian, legally requiring them to maintain all emails, documents, and records related to my employment and termination. Now comes the fun part, Mrs. Thompson told me during our meeting the following week. Discovery. Her office conference room was covered with documents, printouts, and what looked like a complex timeline spanning several years. She'd been busy. It's even worse than we thought, she said, spreading files across the mahogany table. Jessica Martinez filed an informal complaint with HR about unwanted personal attention from her supervisor before transferring to Portland. Maria Santos requested an emergency transfer after what she described as increasingly uncomfortable interactions with Simon. And there's a sealed settlement agreement with a former employee named Rachel Kim that the company clearly doesn't want us to see. How many women has he done this to? Based on the employment records I've obtained so far, at least 6 over the past 3 years, and those are just the ones who reported something or requested transfers. Mrs. Thompson pulled out a thick folder labeled Crawford, Simon, Background Investigation. I've also been investigating Simon's employment history. Did you know he was terminated from his previous position at Convergent Financial for policy violations? No details in his file. But I have contacts there. She opened the folder and pulled out what looked like legal documents. I reached out to an attorney friend who handles employment cases in Portland. Turns out, Convergent Financial paid out a $400,000 settlement to two female employees who accused Simon of sexual harassment. The settlement included a non-disclosure agreement, which is why it never came up in his background check at Meridian. I felt sick. So they just let him move on to another company to do the same thing. Welcome to corporate America, Mrs. Thompson said grimly. Companies often choose the cheapest option, which is usually paying victims to stay quiet rather than properly addressing predatory behavior. It's like a shell game: pass the problem to the next employer and hope it doesn't come back to bite you. She pulled out another document. But here's where it gets interesting. I found the original complaint against Simon at Convergent. One of the victims was a 26-year-old financial analyst named Amy Peterson. The other was a 24-year-old administrative assistant named Lauren Chang. Both described nearly identical patterns of behavior: personal dinner invitations, professional retaliation when declined, escalating pressure, and ultimately termination or forced resignation. It's exactly what he tried to do to me. Exactly. Which means this isn't just about your case anymore, Gia. This is about stopping a pattern that's been allowed to continue for years. Mrs. Thompson leaned forward, her expression intense. I want to do more than just get you a settlement. I want to expose the whole system that enables men like Simon to move from company to company, leaving a trail of victims behind them. That's when I knew my case was about more than just getting my job back or receiving compensation for what I'd endured. This was about stopping a predator and holding accountable the companies that protected him. Mrs. Thompson introduced me to David Park, an investigative journalist with the Seattle Times who specialized in corporate misconduct stories. David was a soft-spoken man in his 40s who took meticulous notes and asked probing questions that showed he understood the broader implications of what we were discussing. This isn't just about your case, he explained during our first meeting at a coffee shop near his office. This is about a systemic failure to protect employees. Companies are essentially laundering sexual predators by allowing them to move between organizations without consequence. David had been investigating what he called the NDA industrial complex, the practice of using non-disclosure agreements to hide misconduct while allowing perpetrators to continue their careers elsewhere. Simon Crawford is a perfect case study, he said, flipping through his notebook. Meridian hired him without doing adequate due diligence because Convergent settlement agreements prevented his victims from speaking out. Now he's created new victims at Meridian, and the cycle continues. Over the next 2 weeks, David conducted his own investigation parallel to Mrs. Thompson's legal work. He tracked down 3 women from Simon's previous job who were willing to speak on background, despite their NDAs. He also uncovered 2 additional cases at Meridian that had been quietly settled before reaching formal complaint status. The pattern is clear, David told me during one of our meetings. Simon targets ambitious women early in their careers, uses his position to pressure them for personal relationships, then retaliates professionally when they refuse. The companies know what he's doing, but they find it cheaper to pay off individual victims than to address the behavior systematically. Until now, Mrs. Thompson added with satisfaction. David's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Simon's behavior had escalated over time. At Convergent, his harassment had been limited to verbal pressure and professional retaliation. At Meridian, witnesses described him making increasingly physical gestures, standing too close, touching shoulders unnecessarily, even blocking office exits during confrontational conversations. He's getting bolder, David explained. That's typical for serial harassers who face no real consequences. Each time they get away with their behavior, they push the boundaries a little further. The thought that I might have been his next escalation target made my skin crawl. But it also strengthened my resolve. How many other women would Simon target if his pattern continued unchecked? 3 weeks after my termination, Mrs. Thompson received a call from Meridian's legal team. They wanted to discuss a mutually beneficial resolution to my complaints. The meeting was held in a sterile conference room at Meridian's downtown headquarters. Present were Mrs. Thompson and myself, Meridian's general counsel, Patricia Webb, HR director Susan Chang, and a nervous-looking man I didn't recognize who was introduced as outside counsel. Ms. Miller, Patricia Webb began, we deeply regret any misunderstandings that may have occurred during your employment here. We'd like to discuss a resolution that would be mutually beneficial to all parties. Mrs. Thompson's expression didn't change. What kind of resolution are you proposing? We're prepared to offer Ms. Miller a generous severance package, 6 months' salary, plus benefits continuation in exchange for her agreement to withdraw her complaints and sign a standard non-disclosure agreement. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing. After everything David had uncovered about NDAs being used to hide misconduct, they were offering to pay me to stay quiet. Ms. Webb, I said, my voice carefully controlled. Are you offering me money to stay quiet about sexual harassment? The outside counsel's eyes widened. Susan Chang shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Patricia Webb maintained her professional composure, but I could see tension around her eyes. We're offering you a chance to resolve this matter quietly and professionally, Webb replied. These kinds of workplace conflicts can be disruptive for everyone involved. Including Mr. Crawford? Mrs. Thompson asked innocently. Mr. Crawford continues to be a valued member of our team, Webb said carefully. Mrs. Thompson pulled out a folder and placed it on the conference table. Before we discuss any resolution, I think you should be aware of what we've discovered during our investigation. She opened the folder and began laying out documents Simon's employment history. The settlement agreements from Convergent, witness statements from current and former Meridian employees, and my recorded conversations. We've identified at least 8 women who have been subjected to similar behavior from Mr. Crawford across 2 companies, Mrs. Thompson said calmly. We have documented evidence of a pattern of sexual harassment and retaliation spanning more than 4 years, and we have recordings of Mr. Crawford explicitly linking my client's employment to her willingness to attend personal dinner meetings. The color drained from Patricia Webb's face. The outside counsel was frantically scribbling notes. Susan Chang looked like she might be sick. Furthermore, Mrs. Thompson continued, we have evidence that Meridian failed to conduct adequate background screening when hiring Mr. Crawford, despite the availability of information about his previous misconduct. She placed one final document on the table. This is a draft complaint we're prepared to file in federal court, alleging not just individual harassment and retaliation, but systematic negligence in hiring and supervision. The damages we're seeking reflect the severity and scope of the misconduct. I couldn't see the number at the bottom of the page, but I could see it was enough to make Patricia Webb's eyes widen significantly. We'll need to discuss this internally, Webb said, gathering up the documents Mrs. Thompson had shared. Of course, Mrs. Thompson replied, but I should mention that we'll be filing with the court by the end of the week unless we receive a satisfactory response. As we left the building, I asked Mrs. Thompson about the draft complaint. How much are we asking for? She smiled. Enough to make them take this seriously. Enough to make other companies think twice before hiring predators, and enough to compensate you for everything you've been through. And if they don't settle, then we go to trial, and this becomes very public very quickly. The article was scheduled to run on a Sunday morning, which meant it would hit the web Saturday night when people were scrolling through their phones. Mrs. Thompson had coordinated with Meridian's legal team to ensure they received advance notice not out of courtesy, but to give them one last chance to make a very expensive mistake. Sure enough. Friday afternoon, I received a call from Patricia Webb. Miss Miller, I understand you've been in discussions with a journalist. We'd like to schedule an emergency meeting to discuss a revised settlement offer. I'm listening. We're prepared to offer you a substantial settlement significantly more than our previous offer in exchange for your agreement to withdraw all complaints and refrain from making public statements about your employment here. I could barely contain my laughter. Ms. Webb, you're aware that my attorney and I will be reviewing any offer carefully. Of course, but time is of the essence here. We'd need an answer by tomorrow afternoon. I'll discuss this with my attorney and get back to you. Mrs. Thompson was practically gleeful when I called her. They're panicking. David's article must be even more damaging than we expected. Saturday night. David's article went live on the Seattle Times website. Seattle financial firm allowed accused harasser to target multiple employees. Way in by Sunday morning, it was trending on local social media. By Monday, it had been picked up by CNN, NBC, and the Wall Street Journal. The article was devastating. David had managed to speak with 5 women who described nearly identical experiences with Simon across 2 companies. He'd also obtained copies of the settlement agreements with victim names redacted, showing a clear pattern of companies paying accusers to disappear rather than addressing the underlying problem. But the most damaging part was David's investigation into Meridian's hiring practices. He'd discovered that the company had failed to contact any female employees at Simon's previous job during their reference checks, a glaring oversight that suggested they either didn't want to know about his history or didn't care. The article included my story in detail, complete with excerpts from my recorded conversations with Simon. Hearing his words in print, the casual threats, the blatant linking of my career to personal relationships made them sound even more damning. Tuesday morning. I was getting coffee when my phone rang. It was Simon. "You've destroyed everything," he said without preamble. His voice was shaking with rage, and I could hear what sounded like traffic in the background. "My career, my reputation, my family, you've ruined it all because you couldn't take a simple dinner invitation." I'd been expecting this call, and I was ready. I'd already started recording. "Simon, this call is being recorded, and my attorney has advised me not to speak with you directly. If you have something to say, you can communicate through legal channels." Legal channels. He laughed bitterly, but there was hysteria in it. "You think this is about legality? This is about a vindictive woman who couldn't handle the realities of corporate advancement." The realities of corporate advancement shouldn't include sexual harassment and retaliation. Sexual harassment. His voice rose to a near shout. "I asked you to dinner. I tried to help your career. Everything I did was about professional development. Simon, I have recordings of you explicitly linking my job security to accepting your personal invitations. I have documentation of you retaliating against me professionally after I declined. I have evidence of you doing the same thing to at least 5 other women." The silence stretched out for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was lower and more dangerous. "You have no idea what you've started. I have connections, resources, lawyers who make yours look like public defenders. This isn't over." "You're right," I said calmly. "It's not over. But Simon, I've been documenting everything for months. I've been preparing for this moment since the day you first suggested I needed to be more of a team player. And now the whole world knows exactly what kind of team player you are." I hung up and immediately forwarded the recording to Mrs. Thompson. The week following the article's publication was a whirlwind of activity that exceeded even Mrs. Thompson's expectations. 3 more women came forward with similar stories about Simon, including one from his college days, who described a pattern of behavior dating back more than 15 years. Meridian's stock price dropped 12% in 2 days as investors worried about potential liability and reputational damage. The company's CEO was forced to hold a press conference addressing their commitment to workplace safety and respect, a carefully worded statement that fooled no one. But the most satisfying moment came Thursday morning when Mrs. Thompson called with news that made me actually pump my fist in the air. "Meridian just fired Simon for cause," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. They also terminated his severance agreement and are demanding repayment of his signing bonus. How much was his signing bonus? $50,000. Plus, they're supporting our federal complaint rather than fighting it. I nearly dropped my phone. They're what? They want to settle quickly and publicly, showing they take this seriously. They've also agreed to implement new harassment prevention policies and bring in outside consultants to review their hiring practices. What about other women who were harassed? That's the best part. They're establishing a compensation fund for any employee who experienced similar treatment. We're talking about potential payments in the millions. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't done. There's more. The Washington State Attorney General is launching an investigation into the use of NDAs to hide sexual harassment. Your case is being cited as evidence of why these agreements need stronger oversight. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. This is bigger than I expected. It's bigger than any of us expected. You haven't just gotten justice for yourself. Gia, you've started a movement. 6 months later. I was sitting in my new office at Equity Partners, a boutique consulting firm that specialized in helping companies develop ethical workplace policies. My title was Senior Director of Workplace Analytics, and my job was exactly what it sounded like, using data to identify patterns of discrimination and harassment before they became lawsuits. The settlement with Meridian had been finalized at $1.2 million more money than I'd ever imagined having. But more importantly, the case had led to systemic changes that would protect other women. Meridian had implemented new harassment prevention policies, revised their hiring practices to include comprehensive background checks, and established an independent ombudsman to handle workplace complaints. Simon had been quietly forced to resign from 2 subsequent positions as David's reporting continued to follow his career moves, the last I'd heard. He was working for a small accounting firm in Spokane, his reputation in shambles and his options severely limited. The women who'd spoken out received settlements totaling over $3 million. Jessica Martinez had returned from Portland and was now working as a senior financial analyst at a competing firm. Maria Santos had been promoted to HR director. Even Rachel Kim, the woman who'd been silenced by her NDA at Convergent, had come forward and received additional compensation. More importantly, the story had sparked broader conversations about corporate accountability and the need for transparency in harassment cases. 3 states had passed legislation limiting the use of non-disclosure agreements in sexual harassment settlements. A federal bill was working its way through Congress. I'd also started speaking at universities and professional conferences about documentation and workplace rights. My favorite part was always the Q&A sessions, when young women would ask practical questions about protecting themselves in male-dominated industries. The key is systematic documentation, I'd tell them. Date, time, location, witnesses, exact quotes when possible. Keep records in a secure location that your employer can't access. Use recording apps if your state allows it. And remember, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. During one particularly memorable conference at the University of Washington, a young woman raised her hand and asked, "What if nobody believes us? What if the system protects the harasser?" I thought about Simon's confident smile, his assumption that I'd stay quiet, his shock when the entire system he'd relied on crumbled around him. "The system only protects harassers when we let it," I said. "Document everything. Find allies, hire good lawyers, and don't be afraid to go public when necessary. But most importantly, remember that you're not alone. There are always other victims, and together, we're stronger than any individual predator." My phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Thompson. "Saw the Chronicle article about your consulting practice. Proud of you." The article had been David's follow-up piece about how the women who'd spoken out were rebuilding their careers and driving systemic change. It had run with the headline, "From Victims to Victors: How One Woman's Documentation Strategy Sparked a Movement." I smiled, thinking about that scared, angry woman who'd been escorted out of Meridian 8 months ago. She'd thought her career was over, that Simon had won. She'd had no idea that her methodical record-keeping and refusal to be silenced would lead to the most rewarding work of her life. Simon Crawford had taught me an important lesson, though not the one he'd intended. He'd shown me that predators rely on silence, isolation, and the assumption that their victims won't fight back. But I'd learned that documentation is power, persistence pays off. And sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's building something better from the ashes of what they tried to destroy. My name is Gia Miller. I'm 29 years old, and I'm living proof that when someone tries to make you smaller, the best response is to use their own actions to build something bigger than they ever imagined possible. And if you have an alphabetized spice rack and an obsession with documentation, well, that just makes you a predator's worst nightmare. After all, there's nothing more dangerous to a bully than someone who keeps excellent records.